everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics today. We have Erica Rex with us, who's been on the show a whole mess of times, written for us a bunch, and has a very interesting background and career. Today we're here to talk about bad trips. How are you today, Erica?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
Wonderful, and excited to dig into this. I was just chatting before we started rolling, just talking about how interesting this topic is, how taboo it is to write about. And yeah, like what are these things? And, you know, when medical regulators come in, they're like, oh, that sounds like just a bad effect and we shouldn't have those, right? But maybe it's a feature, not a bug, but let's get into it. So let's first, again, introduce you. You've got a great background. You've written a whole mess of things, a science writing background. How do you like to talk about your writing background and your position in the space?
I would say it's very eclectic, very extensive and intensive in the last 10 years, focusing a lot on psychedelics and on my book, on the topics around that. And I delve into not just the facts of the experience of psychedelic experience, but, social, cultural, psychological, scientific, chemical, brain contexts, which including economics, including societal expectations, because these all play in. And I feel that we need to talk about them with all of that in mind.
There's a certain level of intellectual honesty that you bring to the table around this topic that I really appreciate. Like, on one hand, promise, on the other, peril, and for a lot of reasons. And you grew up in psychiatry. Can you kind of explain how you like to talk about that publicly, or if you'd like?
Well, I escaped from what would otherwise be, I guess you could think of as sort of a bad Thomas Harris novel. Both of my parents were shrinks. It was very violent, very dysfunctional, very alcoholic, very abusive household, and had all the features, like I said, of a very bad Thomas Harris novel, who wrote Hannibal Lecter. And I write about it in my book. Actually, it finally came to the point where I had to actually be explicit about writing about it, and it was not fun. So I think there are a lot of problems built into psychiatry, not just because I was abused at the hands of psychiatrists, but then trying to get help when I got older in the hand from the therapy profession, the kind of gaslighting went on, the kind of protection of protecting this field that really came into being for very strange reasons and has gone on that way. And so I think when talking about psychedelics in terms of a therapeutic model, I really question and have questioned from the beginning, even though I was in the clinical trial at Hopkins, should this be in a medical context? Do these experiences and the therapeutic aspects of these experiences belong in a hospital with a shrink or a therapist in a setting? Because the power dynamic is problematic. Always has been, always will be. Whenever you have two people in a room, there's a power dynamic. And if you got three people in a room, you have a community, and it's diffuse. And you have four people in a room, it's even more diffuse. And then as you get more diffusion, obviously too many is too many. There's probably an optimal number. I don't know how many it is. So that's kind of my position. That I come full circle, and I feel very strongly that psychedelics don't belong in the hospital or the psychotherapy chamber.
So in
And
the clinical frame,
right.
that you believe they don't belong. And did you see the recent stuff coming from MindMed, where I think it was MindMed, and don't sue me, guys, if I said the wrong thing in the show. I promise I'll correct it later. And I think, like, there's they're arguing that they're providing psychological support and safety outside of a clinical frame while people are in the experience, which is, to me, it looks a lot more like holotropic breathwork psychological support and or the Zendo project psychedelic or psychological support, which I really like, though it's not perfect, right? But they got pretty good results in the clinical trials without therapists in the room. But what do you? So you're smiling. So, what do you think?
I think that that's going to be the model now, or my ideal model would be something like that. I think that there's a lot of uh, good, positive data for situations like ayahuasca churches. They have very good results. I mean, when they're in community settings, and there are several
Not
people.
overly focused on money.
No,
Yeah, you saw the
no,
recent ayahuasca church case out of Florida, right? But
I didn't.
that's rare. Well, the ayahuasca church called Soul Quest lost a case recently, and is ordered to pay the family a bunch of money for a death. It's a whole complicated thing. I would have to read up on it a whole bunch before I wanted to talk about it on the show. But yeah, but that's one, right? We don't hear
Right.
about this all the time. Like, generally speaking, it seems like they get good results. It's pretty safe.
Yeah,
Um, People are relatively satisfied with their experience.
and they have sort of a mission. It really is a community focused. It's the whole point of the ayahuasca church is it's part of a sort of social cultural meaningful experience. It's not just I'm going to go there and do drugs so that I'm safe. It's there's something more that's supposed to happen there, and it seems to be usually. I mean, yes,
Right.
people always have ad. I mean, there was a case recently in France where somebody took a was in a guided situation with a couple of people, had both psilocybin and then unfortunately also then took 5-MeO. If your heart is perfect, you're fine, but they didn't know or he didn't tell them that he had an existing heart condition, and he died during the session because of the enormous fluctuation in what it does to the vasopressor situation. So he had a heart attack and died, and that just happened. I don't know, a couple of months ago.
Mm,
Again,
that's sad.
you don't know if people don't disclose what their medical status is, what they're coming in with.
Right. And it's really hard to get people to be 100% honest with you for a lot of reasons. And that's it's tragic, right? Because there's so much room for us to be helping people with this business, and it's not always the case that we're going to know. And some people will get hurt, just like contemporary medicine, right? Like a Adderall or something, like somebody with crazy high blood pressure, maybe they're able to skirt around it, or Xanax, they can lie their way through it. I think William Burroughs did a bunch of interesting writing about scoring from physicians, and he like had his scripts. And that's it's tragic. It's also we're forced into this situation by lack of access to the things we want. So laws aren't good enough to make us not want to break them.
Which
Or I don't know.
which
Go ahead.
tangentially brings me to this recent development from the sixth of the recommendation against approving MDMA on the part of the panel that was impaneled to make the recommendations
I
to the.
assume you know a bunch about this.
I
You've been
do,
following it.
yes.
Um, I recorded with an FDA regulator the other day. I really want to chat with you after you get a chance to hear this. She used to work, or former, she used to work on the MDMA, or sorry, psychedelic wing of the FDA.
Mhm.
And, but continue. Sorry, I cut you off there. I'm
Oh, no, okay.
definitely curious about, like, what's your read on what happened there?
I'll just
And
quickly, I will
we got
just
to circle back to bad trips eventually.
Yes, I will just quickly sort of fill this in for those of you who are not familiar with this. So effectively, they decided based on the data that they heard and all of the evidence that they heard, and they heard. I mean, I listened to almost 9 hours. I listened to almost all the testimony. It
Oh my
was,
gosh.
you know, um, that they could not recommend in this hearing to after this hearing to the FDA to approve Lykos's bid. This is very specific. Lykos Pharmaceuticals, formerly MAPS, but Lykos is now, was formerly a public benefit corporation. So this speaks to how things evolve for people. Could not recommend that Lykos's presentation warranted their recommending approval for their drug and their protocol. And, this caused a flap. However, I think one of the problems, of course, is MDMA as a drug presents a lot of problems of its own. And so the bad trip component is an interactional bad trip. It's, let's say there's a blinding problem because people know whether they've got drug or placebo. There is the addictive, they didn't want to talk about. There's the euphoria. Euphoria was never reported in any of the studies as an adverse event. It was never.
What do you think it's an adverse event? I think it's awesome.
No, but you have to. It is, but you have to consider it if you're doing the kind of science they say they're doing.
Sure. Why do you think the FDA didn't pin them on that ahead of time, like given the breakthrough status?
They didn't, but the advisory panel did, because MAPS has done.
Yeah, but FDA is riding shotgun. They should have been like, yo.
But they didn't do the breakthrough because of this is a whole big fluffing thing that's been going on for 25 years now. It's been very successful. They had a very effective PR campaign. Veterans need this, and they're such an appealing and a great audience and subject base for this. And the whole thing was so well done, and everybody was a little bit snowed. When you're looking at, which the FDA does, addiction profiles for any new drug, it has to be considered. Why wasn't it considered for this? It just wasn't. Okay, there is an addiction profile. Why does it matter? Because methamphetamines, into which class MDMA does fit, are highly addictive drugs.
I can use methamphetamines daily.
You could.
MDMA is too expensive, and you don't get the good effect if you do it 3 days in a row. You can. Well, let me be clear. You can, but it's horrifying. I've done it a bunch, and I'm just if I want the good effects from it, I have to take substantial breaks. And any intelligent user will know that. And they're like, I could go a lot further if I just had methamphetamines. Methamphetamines are more appropriate for if your goal is abuse.
There's also considerable cytotoxic effects.
Cytotoxic. What is cytotoxicity?
Cellular damage.
Tell me about that. I've not heard of this.
Prolonged use, frequent use, liver, urinary system, biosystem.
Interesting. I've not heard of that.
Use. And then there's another component which, because it's idiosyncratic and doesn't happen that much, is psychosis that can set in. There have been reports, and I've read one of them, of a sudden onset after a MDMA session of psychosis that then doesn't go away. And so maybe they always had that psychosis, but it wasn't brought to a head.
They had great character armor to keep it.
And then with
there's a lot of questions there, right? But how many people die in a normal drug trial, right? I think a good amount of people die in.
They die more of the disease. Then there was the whole suicide problem, that there were more suicides, that they were, or attempted.
Did that
suicide.
Get brought up in the AdCom?
Yes, it was. Okay. It was. No, not in the outcome. They were suppressing that. That was the other thing. That these.
I mean, the AdCom, the FDA advisory committee meeting, that didn't come out in it.
Because it wasn't reported in the any of the things that was, again, one of these things that MAPS, Lykos had chosen. Well, we don't talk about that because it doesn't count, because it didn't happen the day after it, so we don't need to count it, and the suicidal ideation, so they didn't count that. The other thing, finally, just to give you, is that there was a huge placebo effect because people who are being supported to have terrible times with people with therapy do a lot better when they're getting support and therapy. That's been really documented and really studied. That people who have studied psychiatric drugs report this repeatedly. The most therapeutic thing that happened was the interaction with the doctor. You could see that people would feel better, or the interaction with other people suffering. So, and MAPS just said, I mean, I even talked to them about this months, years ago. It's like, well, there's the placebo. We don't talk about that. We're not even bothering with those. Like, well, okay.
I just don't see why the placebo thing's a problem. We don't have to go much further. I want to get into bad
Not that
trips.
it's a problem, it has to be included.
Yeah,
And
we shouldn't ignore it, but the data should show it pretty clearly. You have the charts and everything.
they left it out. They just took it out. They
I
did.
thought it was pretty clear that it came through in the FDA AdCom meeting. Like there was a lot of great
No,
commentary.
Amy Emerson made a very clear point that I actually quote in my book about we're not taking, we don't bother with placebo effects. It's not our remit.
Well, that's interesting. I would love for you to have a debate with somebody on this at some point, and maybe I can line you up with somebody to have this debate with. And I particularly, knowing what I know about biotech, it's a friggin' con most of the time, and like the science has to be there. And there's, I think I personally think it should have gone through. I do think a lot of these things should have, and this is just an advisory committee suggestion to the people that approve the drug, right? There's still a substantial, like, non-zero chance that it will be approved as a drug.
Or this isn't their only chance. This was
yeah.
just Galapagos's chance, their first chance. And another drug company doing in this business now has a chance to make their own application and say, we want our version of MD.
Which Atai Life Sciences is doing this. Like Peter Thiel's buddy Christian Angermeyer is pushing this one through, and it'll be a similar molecule but different molecule. They allege better safety, and they're about as biotech as you get. I would have rathered the hippies one than like somebody aligned with Thiel. So that's just me. I don't know. So anyway, let's get into bad trips. A lot of people thought this AdCom meeting was a bad trip. Some people thought it was their favorite dream ever come true. But
I think they need to take more account of the dynamics of therapy, that the therapeutic, the biggest problem, it pointed to the biggest problem in psychotherapy, that the training manual, that the stuff is done in the sessions, that is not regulated, and it needs to be. And they're regulating almost the wrong thing by regulating the drug and not,
I
they're going to do it that
suppose way. FDA doesn't regulate therapy, and like I'm always really concerned about more regulation on things.
Except that then that's why it shouldn't be in the doctor's office. Period, because it's going to be safer if it's not in the doctor's office.
And my position, safe supply all day long. The drug war kills people. So 100% legalization. Absolutely. And I'm with you. And I'm in support of multiple pathways. I just, I don't trust that biotech and medicine as a whole will not try to come down and suppress us once they have it in their grips, right? Oh, safety. I'm like, hey, fuck off. Like, safety, you're killing people by putting them in jail. Like, that's mine. Anyway, let's dig into bad trips. Speaking of bad trips, that's one of mine, is yelling about the drug war all the time. So, do you have like a term or definition you like to throw in when talking about bad trips to like describe what they are? I don't, but I can try to come up with one on the fly. Not really.
I can't think. I was trying to think of one, actually. I can't think of a description other than bad trip. I mean, they call them adverse experiences. I mean, that doesn't begin to do it. I mean, that's not the right term either. Adverse event. An adverse event is like suicidal ideation. That's not a bad trip.
And suicidal ideation, to me, like we're getting like so medicalized, right? Like we're so colonized by medical language that we can't even be human with each other. And like I in my personal opinion, suicidal ideation is quite natural and part of life. And like who was it? Albert Camus saying the only real philosophical question is should I kill myself or not? And like that's so fundamental to like contemporary culture. It's alien to a lot of uncolonized First Nations. Like why would I think like that? But you know, it still happened there. Uh, you know, honor was a big honor culture is like a
Mhm.
really big thing, and suicide is part of that for a lot of folks. Anyway, uh, bad trip. I have a few. I asked. I hate doing it, but I always ask the AI gods for a little bit of help here and there. But I'll read a couple, and we can like kind of comment. So like the general definition, a bad trip is a negative or challenging experience that occurs during the use of psychedelic substances, characterized by intense feelings of fear, anxiety, confusion, and distress. These experiences can be overwhelming and frightening, often leading to a sense of losing control or having distorted perceptions of reality. Uh, Interesting. There's a lot there, right? Like generally, like you were saying, like what you would write on the side of bottle, like of the bottle, if it was a drug, is like the potential negative things you could experience, perceived negative things. But there's so much in there about like how we process things in our psyche and body. Sometimes don't feel great. Sometimes it can be quite horrible. Like I've had these experiences in breath work, but they were regularly the most productive experiences I had had, as they exposed a lot of things that were really painful. And then I could work with them later. Like, I think one of the frames missing here is that the drug experience is the thing that heals. I'm like, well, the drug experience is the thing that could potentially precipitate the week or month long, multi-month long project that heals versus like, oh, cool, I'm all good now 20 minutes later if it's 5 or something,
Exactly.
right?
Excellent point.
Um, yeah. Anything on that definition I read there, what I just
Well,
said for you?
I, I think it touches on most of the features. Certainly, I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
can't come up with a 3 word um, compression of that, or a sort of cuter or more aesthetically pleasing one than bad trip. For me, it was if I can talk about how my recent relatively recent bad trip informed everything I thought I knew
Yeah,
about
let's
bad.
run through this. Yeah.
Yeah. So, um,
We
and
haven't had a chance to debrief on this really yet.
no, and I in the context of rewriting a portion of my book to try and make it more marketable and accessible to what was suggested to me by this one editor as a was to expand the memoir part. And so I had dived into that project, which brought up a whole lot of stuff for me because it was stuff that I hadn't visited. I had visited some stuff and that I had written about earlier in the book, but then this was stuff that I hadn't visited and addressed. And in that, I decided that one of the things I would see a trauma therapist who is excellent. She's in I mean seeing her over I was seeing her over Zoom, but then I would also seek out and I did a private MDMA session. I did an MDMA session by myself, which is extremely useful. It was great. It wasn't great. It was
Did you ever read
painful.
MDMA solo? Um,
No, but I've done it
I'll send
twice.
it over later. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we should talk about that because it's been my most productive MDMA experiences have been 2 that I've done on my own. And they were the most illuminating of any MDMA experience I've had, which is not a huge number, but it's enough. So I decided that I was going to do a psychedelic experience and I was going to do it with a guide who lives in another state who was available. And I've had in the past very stunted experiences with psilocybin. And so it had been recommended to me by a friend in France that I use um, Syrian rue, which is as a tea. It is a psychoactive, but it is. it is an MA, a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And one of the theories about why I was having these stunted experiences with mushrooms was because of I had an excess of monoamines, and that
Yeah.
if I inhibit or not enough, I don't remember which, whatever. Yes, it was. I had not enough, and that because that's a sign of that's one of the symptoms, one of the biological symptoms or measures of depression. And so monoamine oxidase inhibitors were actually an antidepressive for, still are. So so I thought, okay, this is a good idea, and the person I was going to be doing this trip with was aware of that, and she had asked many people she knew about ideal dosing, and she had a very explicit idea about dosing. And so the first mistake I made, just so you know, and it's clear, was that I had read and read and read, and where they had suggested 1 gram of Syrian rue tea, I put 6 grams myself tea, so it was way too strong. And then I don't remember how many grams of mushrooms I had, 3.
Yeah.
So, because I was so sure that because my experiences from previous experiences with a couple of times had been massive amount of mushrooms with practically no effect except for a sort of minor dysphoria, which left me kind of like feeling horrible for the better part of an afternoon. At one time, 10 grams of dried mushrooms. That was in Paris during the pandemic. And my guide, who was the French friend whom you've met, um, was just shocked. He's like, I can't believe this. You should be just tripping. And, he would give me a little more and a little more and nothing. And nothing. So that was where this conclusion to try monoamine oxidase inhibitor was the right thing to do.
Mm.
So we start
And
there.
I'll just at least suggest that people should be very careful with MAOIs.
Be very
There's a
careful.
lot of problems that you could precipitate. So please work with professionals that you think you trust. And maybe I'd also advise just upping what it takes for you to trust somebody.
Yes, and do not take a dose that is beyond the minimal possible to do what you need to do, because they're very, very potent.
Mm-hmm.
Even at this, I didn't know this, at the smallest dose of tea. So, what would you like me to talk about, Joe?
All right. So you really needed an experience, or that was your sense. You really wanted to get into some inner work that a non-drug clinician exposed for you. Is that right? Some really painful stuff, and you're like, okay, I want to go in, I want to work on this and resolve it, which is quite brave, I'll say. But you had done a substantial amount of inner work previously, and you felt ready. So let's approach it this way, which to me is head on. It's like it's a good brute force approach often, but it can
Yeah,
be intense. And what substances did you want to work with again? Wasn't it
I, I,
5-MeO and mushrooms?
no, it wasn't 5-MeO. It was, um, I just had Syrian rue. And in this situation, I just had Syrian rue and mushrooms. I would never use anything with 5-MeO. It's way too strong. I would not touch anything in conjunction with 5-MeO ever. That's just me. You want to mess with it, mess with it. I won't. I think it's a very, very, very complicated drug. And uh, that's, I feel very strongly about that. Um, so this was, like I said, I had spoken with a couple of people. Okay, try this. And so, I went in and with these intentions. And um, would you like me to describe what happened, more or less?
Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I was in a hotel with in a resort in New Mexico, and it was a very nice environment. And the person I was with was not someone I had known before in person, but I had gotten to know her over time. And she's interesting woman. She's done a lot of guiding. She's had a lot of um, transpersonal, other kinds of experiences, out of body kinds of experiences. So she's very familiar with altered states. I was very confident that she knew what she was doing. She also was a naturally patient and kind person. I knew that much about her. And so she came over and we set off and very quickly. So the induction phase was quite pleasant, and actually it reminded me of ayahuasca. The images were, the entities were very much like that. There was a playfulness, there was a beauty about patterns and fractals and all that happening, and a playfulness to it. And I thought, okay, this is going to be okay. And suddenly, all of a sudden, very suddenly, it turned very, very dark. And I was confronted with entities who were basically telling me, you're trying to escape your death. You've been traveling around, you've gone all these different places. You think you're, and it was very ugly, bright light, and it was ugly and yellow, and they were very distorted people, and they were shaped in a very unesthetic way, and the atmosphere became very, very, very sinister, and that you are trying to. It was valuable information. You are trying to escape something. You've never come to grips with certain things about your life, and all of these moving to different countries. Regardless of the objective reasons, I did it in 2009, which had to do with healthcare. That I was trying to outrun something, that I was stupid. I was like a stupid, foolish idiot, um, and they were very diabolical, and they were making fun of me. They were ridiculing me, and then they began ridiculing me because I was very fearful. And then I felt that they were threatening me, and then they were going to try and kill me, and they were, in a way. They were saying, "Come over here. This is your fate. Go over here." Very, you know, and so of course I did the cardinally wrong thing. I was frightened. I began fighting the experience, and my guide asked me what was going on, and I said, "I'm terrified. It's turned really scary, and I don't want to be here anymore. And well, what's happening?" And she understood. She understands entities very well. She has a and and she was trying to get me to see that I didn't have to agree to anything with them, and that there were alternatives. And she was trying to get me to imagine alternatives. She was giving me alternatives from kind of the mystical Native American world, that there's a crow on your shoulder. Where would you like to go? You can go to the beach. And I could not engage with anything other than my fear. I tried really hard, and I was, saying out loud, I want to go here. I want to go to the beach. I want to go where there's love and kindness. And then some other entities came in, which were very distinctly different. And I said, they're really different now. And she said, well, what are they? And I said, they're trying to take something from me. They want something from me. And she found those to be recognizable to her as an entity which she is familiar with and seen before, which is really interesting because oftentimes in these situations, you would have a guide who would just not be able to kind of enter and kind of understand the experience. She said, they want something from you. That's because they've given you something in a different life or in a different place, and they are trying to master you with that, and you take it, and she made me gesture. She said, take it and throw it at them because you don't need it. So I did. I gestured and I threw it at them, and they kind of backed off. But that it kind of went like this in waves for 7 hours, and I was in this state of terror the whole time, existential terror, sure that I was going to be killed, that I was dying. And she sat there, and I was afraid to have her leave. She wanted to go get some ice. I said, you can't leave the room. And she did eventually. I could cope with it. And it just became a question of enduring this horrific experience from which I could not disengage my fear. And that was, I mean, all of the training I've had and all of the understanding where you approach them, you ask them what they want, you tell them to go away. None of that was working. I was completely overwhelmed with my anxiety. And finally, and she stayed. She was very, very good, and was very supportive and saying, and I would say, well, how much longer? I would, come to a point of coherence. How much longer? Well, 7 hours is going to be 7 hours. We're, 5.5 in. But I was so, I couldn't stand up. One of the things was that I didn't have any ability to walk around with that. And I finally got to a point at a certain point where she had said, when you can stand up, the best thing that we could do is for you to take a freezing cold shower. And the other thing was, I was so paranoid, I had got this idea that I should go to the ER and get a shot
Mm,
of Thorazine or something. And she was
mm,
saying, we're not going to do that. It's the stupidest thing in the world. I mean, it was just, and I knew that even intellectually, that's not what you want to do. You don't want to do that. And when I said, I think I should, because I then became very afraid that I was going to be in this psychosis forever. It was going to last forever, that I wouldn't come back, that I wanted to come back and I couldn't come back. Anyway, it was no fun for her, I know, and certainly no fun for me. And finally, I got to a point where I could walk and go into the bathroom and take a freezing cold shower, which is also, is good for anxiety at any time. If you can't get rid of your anxiety, sometimes a freezing cold shower will cut it. That or getting absolutely terrified by something. Um,
yeah. For me,
and
that's a cold shower.
cold
Uh,
shower.
oh my
Yeah.
god, that sounds like a nightmare. On all counts, like having to pull the cord with a cold shower.
Well, it was
Mhm,
actually a good thing. So she
mhm.
probably
If
cut
it
it
works
out.
for you, great. I'm horrified of cold showers. That's all I'm saying.
Oh,
Um,
well, yeah.
um, so that's wild. Okay, so um,
And
I'm
so
gonna
then,
read another definition here, the medical definition. Um, bad trip is described as an acute episode of intense psychological distress during the use of hallucinogenic drugs. Symptoms may include extreme fear, agitation, delusions, and psychotic like symptoms. In some cases, medical intervention may be required to manage the symptoms and ensure the safety of the individual experiencing the bad trip. Um, like, it seemed like you were veering medical near the end, obviously, right? Like, how do you, we know how to stop it, and it's with one of these injections, right? And it's like quick, it's a quick off switch.
on the other hand, there's a couple of problems with that. If she had taken me to an ER, I mean, she was joking later, I would have left you in a ditch, she said, but that's okay. I mean, it's
Bah.
fine. She said, the fact of the matter is going to an ER in that state, think about an ER, can provoke an even worse reaction. I mean, think about how an ER is. You get in an ER, you're in a very, very, very disoriented and not altogether integrated state. And ERs then present you with a bureaucracy, bright lights, an examining room, doctors who are then questioning what you've done and why you've done it, and they're going to wait to give you the shot of Thorazine because have to check, safety and this and that and the other thing. So an ER might not have been the right thing. She knew it, and intellectually I knew it. But staying put, if I could tolerate it, was probably the right thing, and that's what happened. So there's a lot of ramifications to a decision to go to an ER in that situation. And I
Right.
mean, my pulse hadn't changed much. I mean, my heart rate had increased, but in fact, I wasn't in any kind. And my skin was a little clammy. That's the monoamine oxidase inhibitor. You have to be very careful of that. if you start to be a little clammy, then that's you've had too much of it. And so she was very aware of all that, and I was too. I couldn't sense it as much, and that was the decision that was taken, and that was what we did.
Yeah.
And
So how was it when you came down? Were you like, "Oh my god, I can't believe I survived that"? Was it like almost like a near miss car accident? And then what were the following days like?
the coming down thing was a very, very, very long process. After she had to leave because she lived far away on a mesa, and she had a dog at home and a cat and things she had to do. And so she waited until she knew that she went and got some food. I wasn't going to eat it, but um, that she knew that I was in a safe space, and we had a plan, which was I was going to call the Fireside Project, and that she was going to go and she was going to call me on the way back, and that I was going to be okay. Um, but the thing was that the effects endured. I would be, completely in what Roland used to call consensual reality, and then I would feel like I was back in the space, or I would just have the feeling. And but I had enough of the lucid. Here I am. The chair's real. Everything's solid. I know where I am. I know what I'm doing. That it was clear that a process had started to take place where I was coming back. Um, and so I was, when she left, I called the Fireside Project and spoke with them for over 2 hours. It was funny. It was a young guy who was in college, majoring in psychology, but he had done a lot of, he had done a lot of drugs, and he had done a lot of volunteering. And he was clearly very well trained. He knew exactly what to ask and what to not ask, and he was aware of these kind of waves of how it would come and go, this extreme anxiety. And he even measured it. We would talk, and we would be talking about some other things, and I would say, it's, oh God, it's coming back again. And he pointed out at a certain point in the process, he said, I know you don't feel as though you're getting better. Because I was really scared. I said, am I going to be like this for the rest of my fucking life? And he said, actually, I've been timing, as you've said, I am starting to get anxious again. He said, when we first started talking, it was like every 10 minutes. He said, now you're at about 25 minutes since the last one, and then the one before that. And so that was very good information. He was able to provide an objective kind of frame. And finally, well, towards, and so they sign off at, they have a cutoff. I mean, they're not 24/7. And so when they were, close to being done, we signed off. And but I was fine. I mean, not fine, but I had gotten to a place where I was more exhausted than anxiety ridden. Um, in the more, I had texted my friend Vincent, um, and he said, as soon, so I knew that I could text him as soon as I woke up in the morning, because it was 7 hours later. And then he and I talked for a very long time, and he was very philosophical about it, and said, you're not going to be psychotic, and you're already better. And sometimes, and his position, of course, was, please try and remember that this has been an awful experience, but at the same time, you've just done your brain a big favor. So if you can remember that what we want to see here is the neuroplasticity effect. And he said, horrible experience, but your brain is going to be more neuroplastic and more able to see things in a different perspective, no matter what. So can you please do this exercise of trying to go outside for a little while, look at the birds, look at the activity, think of the nice things in your life, which you say you don't have any of right now, of course, but they are
Yeah.
there, and the things you've done, and we talked for a long time. So he saw it very much in the perspective of don't discount the experience and don't discount the benefit, even though it was awful.
How
And
did you
then
relate to that feedback?
I thought it was very valuable. And I um, then the guide came back eventually, midday-ish, and we spent some more time together and went out and about a little bit. And I would have these waves of anxiety that would come and go, and I would be then much better off if I could have something very tactile. We actually went for a walk in the plaza in Santa Fe, and I said, "This is happening again." And she said, "Look, there was a model horse or something with like a blanket of cowhide or something on it." And she said, "Russell Brand says when you're having a bad trip, the best thing you can do is just grab something that you feel. You have to feel it, just feel it." It was true. You just so I would make sure that I was living in the tactile. I would continue to do that. I continued the cold, not frequent cold showers, but I did a few more. We went into the hot tub in the pool in the hotel resort outside, and then the cold thing that worked. So lots of modalities. But what came through, and then I did when I got back home, I did speak to the trauma therapist, and
Mm.
we did some very
Who
good.
had instantiated the situation before or helped uncover the earlier situation?
She and I had been already working because I had been writing. It really started with my rewrite of this book,
That's right.
the fucking book, as I've taken to calling
Yeah.
it, and
Yeah.
adding these chapters that are very disturbing and had to do with childhood incidents and then young adult incidents. So mostly young adult ones were the ones that I hadn't addressed before and was doing now, and that was how it came about. And so she's also very skilled, very spiritual, and very well versed in how these modalities work, how psychedelic drugs work. And so she actually took me semi hypnotically, guided me back to being with these entities and ways in which I could alter how the reaction and the interaction went. And that was very useful. So we did some very good work after that.
So I'm bringing you back to something you said earlier that I don't know if you know how funny it would be to some people. So it was the tactile thing from Russell Brand.
Yes, yeah.
Had you seen that film?
I have not.
Uh, it's Get Him to the Greek, and they accidentally smoke something with
Oh,
PCP and a bunch of other stuff in it. Not accidentally, it was just one person didn't know, and there was a whole like tactile scene. And he's just like rubbing a carpet wall as he's panicking. And it's a pretty amazing scene as far as like comedy goes. Russell Brand's gone in an interesting direction, but we don't need to go there. But yeah, like the tactile thing can really distract folks. I learned recently that some people with autism will get taught certain techniques to distract the sensory processing apparatus away from the problematic thing. So, for instance, if like cold water comes on you and you're panicked and like kind of screaming, you just like rub your arm to like distract. You're giving all sorts of other input. So there's all sorts of like probably similar somatic tools.
stamping your feet, for lack of, I mean,
Right.
stamping feet is a good start.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you need more of a shock than that. Cold, for me, a cold shower is.
Right. So I like to call them challenging experiences. You had a pretty fucking challenging experience. It sounded not great. It sounded like in the end you understood that there was some value, and you probably still feel that way. Though you're like, I wish it was probably a lot easier at this point than it was. Um, yeah, it can't always be that easy. Tragically, I wish, but you learn so much in those states. If you can get through and not be like traumatized, which there is an aspect of which you could have been traumatized, right? and people are, but not everybody has a framework or a community to help them work through that stuff.
Well, that's the thing that I want to point out. I mean, I went into this, and yes, I made a dreadful error, and I was chastised for it both by the guide and then remotely by the person who she got the mushrooms, and they were sort of known mushrooms. They were, the happy mushrooms actually, and I don't remember exactly what variety they were. Who was somebody who was very experienced, who actually made the comment 10, 6 milligrams of Syrian rue is too much. And I'm like, oh, I think it's fine because I've had such stunted experiences in the past. And, basically afterwards I was sort of saying, that was a very dumb error. It was a very dumb error. It was a very dumb, potentially dangerous error because, as you point out, monoamine oxidase inhibitors are dangerous if you take too much of them. And so, end of that. But as months have gone on, and Vincent actually said this. He says it sounds really awful now. He's had some really bad trips, and you actually find that they are, integrated, and you learn something. And I am finding that. I told him I don't care to do drugs ever again, and he said, "Well, okay, put that over there." He said, "I think I'm done. I've had this 14-year experiment that started medically, and now maybe I'm finished." But I had the guide there. I had the Fireside Project, and I knew I had him in the next day. I knew that there were other people with whom I could speak as time went on. I had the therapist who I had an ongoing relationship with, and I think in the end I'm doing okay with it. I got a chance to see what psychosis really felt like, and I don't
Oh,
care to go there again.
psychotomimetic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, well, it's interesting, right? This is where you've landed. And do you think all psychedelics, or do you think just mushrooms and combinations like that?
No, I
Or
can't
where do you?
generalize. I mean, I think you can have
Mm-hmm.
excellent trips and bad trips on anything. I think
Mm-hmm.
that, like I said, as I've repeated now, I made a very stupid, fatal error because of having had a stunted experience with mushrooms alone, read up and been told, you need the Syrian rue is got a naturally occurring monoamine oxidase inhibitor. It's by itself a a hallucinogenic alkaloid. It by itself. I drank it before I took the mushrooms, and I was already buzzed. It was like, this is already a buzz. They obviously use it medicinally in the Middle East, tribally, and that's how it's been used. Um, um, I think that you can have bad experiences on small amounts of drugs. I mean, for instance, I've heard this and I've seen it happen. If you take, for instance, a sub a low dose, a lower dose of MDMA than you would need to get to a certain point, it can be a very, very negative experience. It can be a very, very depressive and peculiarly not positive experience with a long tail. I've heard this. So if you suboptimal doses can do it in any,
Yep.
I believe with any drug. I mean, this is anecdotal. I haven't measured it, but I've heard it many times.
Right.
And
There's this concept of like the dreaded underdose, so you're just like before the threshold of cruising altitude, and you can have monstrous anxiety build up there. Um, so like when I was coming up on ayahuasca my first time, I had a really, really intense fear response for the first 30, 45 minutes or so. And then I broke through past that after the purge and all that, and it was still not easy. It was harrowing, but it was workable. But it was full tilt. Like if I'm in the middle of Manhattan feeling like that, I'm going away for a little while, right on the street. Um, Thankfully, I was in a safe container.
Oh,
I
thank God.
had
Jesus.
hmm?
First I thought you said you were in the middle of Manhattan. I thought, holy shit, did I hear that? No, you weren't in the middle of Manhattan.
Central Park, Times Square. No, kidding, everybody. It was in a real ceremony. It was a real deal for me. And yeah, like it was about as intense as I could imagine having fear. Um, and like I can see why it's really challenging to keep people in the room, and not run away and not want to be hospitalized. Um, yeah, like people will sometimes, get clever and say, I'm having a heart attack, and like that's the thing that can get them out of the room. I think there's a psychedelic comedian that said he was doing that in the middle of the jungle. And it wasn't really helpful because, there's no hospital in days. So you're kind of in big trouble there. Um, so yeah, it's a really complicated topic, and I thank you for sharing. And I just, it's a hard part, but a big part of this work is challenging experiences, if not bad trips. Um, People that want to biomedicalize, like we're just chemical computers, like bad trip, obviously that doesn't work in their model. That's something that we need to avoid at all costs.
But they don't discuss it, which is just
Right.
nonsense.
Or they say that's a negative side effect and we need to remove that from the human,
They
or
take
this
it
whole
out
class
of
of
the,
drugs
they
is
take it out
bad.
of, exactly. It's an adverse event that we don't have to include because it's outside the protocol. It's like
I'm
suicidal.
talking about scientists, not like drug developers, like how you were talking about maps earlier. I'm like, so yeah, it's a problem if we're excluding data that could be
Yes.
helpful data. But my point was like hardcore neuroscientists or like clinical psychologists with a hardcore like um, bent away from people ever feeling negative emotions, which can happen. Everybody, like not all clinicians are perfect. Um, Surprise, but the idea that somebody might need to feel negative feelings to feel poorly for a little while, and if those feelings can get amplified for a while, perhaps in your day-to-day life they're lesser. And that's our frame from the Groff world is um, the full expression of an emotion is also its funeral pyre.
Mm-hmm.
So so we're in breathwork very used to people looking like they're having a very bad time and not having a pleasant experience, but we all collectively agree that this is actually really helpful for them to go through this for a little while. Um, and we're going to try to support them and as best we can make them feel safe and feel supported enough to encounter that stuff head on. Um, yeah, which is a depth orientation, which is not what modern, psychology really operates with.
Nope.
Yeah. Um, so that's why we're so like depth oriented here, and we find it really helpful. And when Maps wrote the manual, one of my teachers was an editor or co-author on the original Maps manuals for MDMA supported or assisted psychotherapy, and all of that was in there at the beginning. Um, that said, the research protocols weren't really part of the here's how we teach the therapist how to do this work. It's very different. Yeah. Um, yeah. So bad trips. Like I see a lot of people who are critical of the psychedelic space generally, and they just lean on this as like the thing that should make us avoid doing any work there, like at all. Like we should leave these things alone, not investigate them anymore. I think we need a lot more research. Like I don't think we really know how to handle these things as a species yet. And I think we need a lot more science to support that effort.
Can I
What do you,
qualify that? I think as
please?
a species we know how to do it because it was done in shamanic and in I wouldn't say tribal is a bad word, I don't like it, but in groups where these events and these substances were used, people were accustomed to this range of experience. And one of the things that, I mean, look at the DSM. We've pathologized every single thing that does not fit into a very narrow frame that all it's designed to do is make sure we continue to go to work and be productive. Who wants people to have these experiences that are just dealing with our humanity and making us more complete? Because that's what they are. When we start to experience the range, we start to have, I mean, it's some of the range is awful. Some of it's ecstatic. Some of it's like 16,000 flavors in between and stuff we haven't even got names for. And the medicalization is the industrialization and is designed so that we can go to work. We don't want grief to be a real thing. We don't want I mean, grief comes to mind always because that was the one that was added to the DSM during COVID. Oops, people are going to be grieving. Let's pathologize that now. Is there going to be a pill for that? Grief disorder. That is ungodly.
Mm-hmm.
Natural human reactions to events and circumstances within the world and within the culture. How else do we know what's going on? And I think this is on the continuum, because I think people were better at dealing with it in a different in a different in a different
Well, we had support. We had different frameworks.
support
Um,
frameworks.
we had real communities. We lived in towns. Um, yeah, it was a whole thing, and we don't have much of that anymore. It's very different now. Like in a lot of ways, culture is the best it's ever been and the worst it's ever been. And you know, uh, some white men have been saying that for a while. Best of times, worst of times, right? It's like perhaps it always is. I don't know. But anyway, we have problems. We have things we want to improve. Um, Bad trips are real. Um, with the right support, you can work with it in a productive way. Um, yeah. Is there anything you think like are super important about bad trips we didn't really hit yet?
I think we've covered most of it. I think the important part is people should be very careful before they go into the situation of understanding that it's always possible to have a bad trip and that having one is not a sign of insanity or an indication that you necessarily did something wrong, or that you have particular emotions that are particularly awful and pathological. It's just part of what is a possible experience when you use these substances. And you can, if you have a way and a context and a network and a core of people who can work with you with them, they can be very useful. It has been for me, it's taken months. It's not even that many months when I think it's all months. Okay, it's been a couple of months. Couple months, yeah. But I think that I had a lot of stuff on my plate. And my own mindset was such that it was going to come to a head at some point. The whole set of circumstances. If you want to avoid uh, reduce the probability of having a bad trip, then perhaps would you might want to consider not doing psychedelics at times of an enormous crossroad in your life. Now, for me, why do psychedelics other than at a crossroad? Because I'm looking for some kind of other way of thinking about things. But sometimes the answers you're going to get in there are not particularly the ones you want. You go in thinking one thing, and guess what? You get a different. You can ask questions. You're not going to get the answers you think you're going to get.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Um, and there are ways, like this underdose thing, there are ways to actually work with that in a meaningful way. Like if you
Yeah.
don't want the most acute of it, you stay sub big, you know. This is what they would call what psycholytic doses.
Mhm.
So you could actually work with it in a more, I don't know, linguistically available frame where you can
Yeah,
actually be
exactly.
communicating with somebody the whole time.
Mhm.
Um, or just really, really, really small doses, maybe a little bit more than a microdose, and you're meditating and sitting with it, doing some really great journaling, and having some support outside of that. Like, you don't need to go big all the time, and it's not necessarily the case that everybody in the world even needs to go big. Like, maybe that's a really special thing for people. I don't want to set rules for the world here, other than, things around endangered species in the space. But I people consider what you can and cannot um, stomach going through at that moment. There's a lot there, and Kyle often says in class, like, before you're going into a session, ask, is it okay if I become like really dysregulated for a while, for a few weeks? I think that's a really big conversation and a really important one. And I don't know that the answer is always yes for folks.
Right.
So, yeah. Anything you want to add to help us wrap this one up?
I think that's a very good point. And
Mm-hmm.
I should have contextualized it already. If I was someone who had to go back into an office the Monday after that experience, that would not have been a good scene. Um, I had a lot of breadth and breathing room in my ability
Yeah,
to navigate that.
for sure.
But,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
And a lot of people in America have to go to work and have to, keep up appearances and all that. And it's really hard, um, and potentially
If,
harmful if you have to hurry.
if there was, you know, as you call it, a container in which, in the event and then peripheral to either side, you had enormous amount of support to process it. It is possible, I think, to go back to work. If we had a structure in place where you could go on a weekend and potentially have the kind of experience I had, that then you had a processing thing lined up. So you started processing before, you went in, you unexpectedly have this terrible time, you're processing it after, you go into work, but then you know that you're processing and you could still be doing that and you don't have to talk about it, but then there are people you can reach out to and that they're in your context, they're in your purview, you can do that. It could
Mm-hmm.
work. I see
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Um, right on. Well, I think that's it for right now. Um, where can people find more about you and your work?
Well, let's see. I have my not uh, much visited lately Substack newsletter, psychedelic renaissance.substack.com, but I have not. I'm going to start writing on that again because there are a number of things coming up that I would like to address, this being one of them. There's my Twitter feed, which I'm not a big fan of Twitter. I think it skews everything in the wrong way. And other than that, I on this website there are a couple of articles. There's an article. Um, there are several podcasts. There's a webcast, and I don't have a website. I'm sorry to report. That just
That's
doesn't
all
seem
right.
to get on my agenda. And I'm hoping soon, at some point, there will be a book because it has been very long in the making, and I hope it gets published.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, let's try to make that happen. Anyway, Erica, thank you so much for being here and sharing that harrowing and very difficult story with us and discussing bad trips. I hope we get to do it again soon.
Without the bad trip part.
Oof, I hope so. I hope so. All right. Thank you.
Thank